Well, welcome everyone joining us today in this really incredible opportunity to hear Billie Faircloth speak with us. My name is Blaine Brownell. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the School of Architecture at UNC Charlotte, and I want to welcome our school community and also other community members, stakeholders, and friends of the school who might be joining us. And this is a really exciting opportunity to hear from one of the leading architectural researchers in practice. In the space with us today, in addition to our lecturer, Greer Friedrich is executive assistant, and Betsy West is faculty in the school. Turns out that Betsy and our lecturer have a history together and know each other from a past life, so to speak, which is exciting. Betsy has been a fundamental partner in coordinating this year's lecture series and done a lot of great work with it. And also in the space today are students from my class, Material Transformations, and I'm really excited for all of you to join us and ask Billie some questions after the talk. So with that, I will begin my introduction. Billie Faircloth is a practicing architect, educator, and partner at Kieran Timberlake, where she leads transdisciplinary research, design, and problem-solving processes across fields including environmental management, chemical physics, material science, and architecture. She received her Bachelor of Environmental Design in Architecture and her Bachelor of Architecture at NC State, as well as her MArch degree at Harvard. And she has taught at several universities, including University of Texas at Austin, University of Pennsylvania, and Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts, among others. Billie fosters collaboration between trades, academies, and industries in order to define a relevant problem-solving boundary for the built environment. She has published and lectured internationally on themes including research methods for transdisciplinary and trans-scalar design practices, the production of new knowledge on materials, climate, and thermodynamic phenomena through the design of novel methods, tools, and workflows, and the history of plastics in architecture. And I highly recommend this wonderful book, Plastics Now. One of my favorites. To demonstrate how architecture's posture towards transdisciplinary practices and new knowledge has changed over time. This year, Billie was inducted into the American Institute of Architects College of Fellows. It is my great pleasure to introduce Billie Faircloth.
Thank you, Blaine. And I want to thank you first for inviting me to address the students at the school and to address the faculty and your stakeholders. It's very rare, I have to say, it's very rare in all the lectures that I do to have a chance to do this, which is to publicly thank someone who shaped my education, Betsy West. Betsy taught me in my very first architecture studio, and I have long since believed that pedagogy is a really important shaper of our perception of agency. So Betsy, I want to thank you for shaping the perception of agency that I might have as an architect. I've carried that with me throughout my career and continue to think about that and pass that on to students. Also the school in general, I have to thank because you conferred a degree to Jim Faircloth, my partner in life, and he has benefited greatly, and I have benefited greatly from that. So many connections, unexpected today, a real pleasure to be here. So yes, you are all, I know the students I can see, you're part of the materials transformation class. And I guess what I want to say is I know you've prepared questions for me, but the one challenge I want to give to you, and maybe it's not a challenge so much as this theme of material transformation is, there's fingerprints of this theme throughout my lecture today. So if there's anything that you see that you want me to pull out and speak to more specifically, very happy to do it. and to directly engage you all in a conversation about things that I might not specifically talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so just give me a second. Okay, and the screen should be blank right now. Is that right? Okay, and just give me another second and I will start the slideshow. Right, and you should now see a slide that says research and practice. Okay, let me just set up my. All right, one more thing here. Okay, so today I'm going to provide a very brief overview of the practice of Karen Timberlake. And I'm going to use 4 projects to discuss aspects of expanding our design agency through inquiry, which is why I titled this Research and Practice. But it's really expanding our agency through inquiry with a focus on outcomes. So these 4 specific projects really try to focus us in on what architecture in space can do. And then I'm going to end by framing about 4 questions for discussion, and maybe really what I'm doing is I'm taking these 4 questions and lumping them together with your set of questions for a broader discussion. So just a little bit about Karen Timberlake and how we're organized. As Billie mentioned, we are a transdisciplinary practice. We're known for architecture, but also for novel envelope concepts, creating hardware, software applications. We're also known for the analysis and studies that we do. We're known for basically creating knowledge for architecture, in addition to creating architecture. We've built a culture of inquiry, and we've established research as a project that requires strategic planning of people, time, and money to do that research. Our research questions absolutely reflect an expression of how we think about design, architecture, and our agency. I say that specifically because inquiry as a mode of design is the underpinning of many practices, and it's deeply connected to design philosophy. We have matured a multi-methods approach that includes measurement, surveying, mapping, modeling, simulation, and prototyping. Those are all methods that we can use, connected to tools that we can use, but really our focus is less on the technical and more on the social aspects, recognizing that the technical is just something that we use to get to very, very specific outcomes for people. And ultimately, we do provide a platform here at our office for people to share knowledge with multiple audiences, both internally and externally. So what does this mean for our projects? Well, it means that projects such as the Tidelands incorporates a line of inquiry on how to achieve ambitious energy and thermal comfort goals through the design of exterior shading, which you can see prominently featured on this project. Or a project like North Campus Housing includes a line of inquiry on the presence of microclimates on a heavily vegetated site and their ability to shape building massing. Or a project like Pound Ridge House reflects a line of inquiry on patterning and weathering of materials in relationship to durability, cost, elimination of bird strikes, and the creation of phenomena on this incredible site. Projects such as the US Embassy of London, and I'm going to go back in time a little bit here, the Cellophane House in 2008, and Smart Wrap. They represent more than a decade of connected research into the efficacy, adaptability, and performance of multifunctional facades. And projects like Multi-Scale Modeling or Ortlieb's Bottling House or Green Roof Vegetative Survey, they also embody our commitment to establishing proactive research test beds. You'll see that those projects are projects of ours, and we're trying to understand, explore hunches, and really deepen our understanding of the relationships between people, architecture, change over time, as well, again, as the efficacy of our design strategies. And each one of the 9 projects I've just briefly mentioned, in whole or in part, represents the purpose and pace of inquiry in our practice, where on a day-by-day, we leverage inquiry to develop actionable insight into design decision-making. Month by month, we have processes here for proving new concepts that have the potential for practice transformation. Year by year, we develop new knowledge on the built environment through longitudinal studies where we set up projects and we study them over time. And then platform by platform, we choreograph new workflows that elevate our profession. So today I want to discuss in a lot more depth than what I just went through. I want to really discuss 4 projects. And really, I've picked these projects because I think they express aspects of our agency to engage inquiry in order to design for resilience, design for health and well-being, and to address climate action. These projects include emergency department mapping or emergency department occupancy mapping, ideal choice homes, designing the 21st century care, and Tally, which is a software that models embodied carbon. I've selected them because they also express a need for transdisciplinary or inquiry-based design and a specific investigation to approaches for transdisciplinary and inquiry-based design. They also represent physical space and places, as well as design practices that are undergoing immense change. These projects also examine themes of time, change over time, timescales, and adaptability over time, and they likewise demonstrate the potential for design interventions to address the inability of a current system to meet the changing needs of people and communities. So the first project I want to start out with, and again, I want to be clear, I'm kind of offering up these projects as case studies for broader discussion. I think there's a lot of themes and lines of discourse that emerge from these projects. So I want to start with ED occupancy mapping. Right around 2016, Karen Timberlake and Jefferson University's Health Design Lab formed a 2-year research partnership to examine this space that you see pictured here. It's an emergency department in Center City, Philadelphia. And you can imagine that this is an incredibly intensive space, 24-hour driven space. And we were interested in understanding the emergency department's experience or the experience of people in the emergency department, but we're really interested in understanding the environment that was there, the interface between nurses, patients, and physicians, and the overall experience of people in this space. Caregivers here were concerned with the flow and function of the emergency department. So with the movement of equipment, location of individual rooms, circulation patterns, and overall ability to adapt to events. In many ways, this was a found space. It's not a space that we designed. It's not a space that we planned in any way. It was a space that was really offered up as a space that needed some further study and a space that was being questioned along the lines of, does this space meet our current needs? So a little bit about the Health Design Lab. I think what's important to know about the Health Design Lab is this is a lab that is specifically set up to connect future doctors and caregivers to design thinking. So they work with a range of different professions, industrial design, architecture, public health, and look at the ways in which design thinking can be used within the field of medicine and caregiving. And in this instance, we work with a team of medical interns, and we organized and built capacity for us as a team, architects and medical interns, to collaboratively survey and study the emergency department. So our ambition was to provide a new way to see the emergency department and to identify opportunities to improve it. And then a secondary goal was to understand the potential for rethinking the emergency department more broadly. So we developed a tablet-based workflow where data was collected, it was structured, stored, and then analyzed using digital mapping tools. The survey was conducted amid the movement of people, equipment, as well as furniture and shift changes within the emergency department. And we used a geolocated set of floor plans that allowed for surveyors to zoom into maps and manually place individuals in space without relying on GPS. Well, there's a number of types of technology that might allow for this kind of tracking. They weren't allowed here in this space. And so much of the work that we did to overcome these technical challenges had a lot to do with trying to find a workflow that fit this place to do the kind of surveying that we wanted to do. We deployed 3 different survey approaches and then attached additional metadata notes or photographs to these individual data points. So For instance, a single point was used to represent the location of a stationary individual, while a multi-point line was used to represent the path of a moving individual. We also formed quantitative comparisons between different spatial configurations. And with these methods in place, we were able to do ultimately what we wanted to do, which is to conduct research through targeted study questions, such as how does the occupancy in the emergency department change over time? And by mapping this trend, hospital staff gained a more holistic understanding of the emergency department. They were able to confirm the stories that they kept telling each other. They were able to confirm areas of congestion and identify opportunities for increased efficiency. And for instance, with this kind of data, the staff reimagined the replacement or a replaced waiting room and a new placement for a waiting room in order to reduce congestion and patient wait times. We were also able to explore the question, what is the relationship between environmental conditions and patient experience? So medical interns used a shadow approach. They tracked individual patients through the emergency department to understand a patient's experience over time. They simultaneously measured factors like temperature, humidity, light, and sound, and they were able to show variation in the environmental conditions per space type over time. And this mapping exercise revealed that some spaces in the ED were quieter or warmer than others, suggesting design improvements for better patient placement. And then finally, we explored the question, how is communication affected by different spatial arrangements? I should say that with this question, this arose out of the first year study. So we did a field experiment in the first year in 2016, asked the two questions I just sort of posed to you, and then we were able to back up and say, what next? What else could we learn in this space? And we really began to understand that there was a central question and desire to know something about how people communicate with each other in this space. What was interesting here is that we were looking at not one space, but many space types, and predominantly those space types being planned according to two different paradigms. So the emergency department is divided into two wings. There's the A side and the B side. And the A side centralized layout concentrates a cluster of nurses and doctors in a workstation surrounded by patient rooms. Whereas the B side's decentralized layout and individual nurse stations distance nurses from other hospital staff in order to situate them closer to patient rooms. So if you studied healthcare design or have some familiarity with these types of layouts, you can see that both of those types of layouts are connected to best practices for patient care. The mapping that we did, which was paired with some statistical analysis, revealed that on average, the B side decentralized layout led to increased communication and contact time between doctors and nurses, despite the distance between their workstations. And that finding was, again, a finding that allowed this community to begin to have more explicit conversations about space. But what is it about this ED study that I think might be of interest for our discussion? So really what the ED study does is it demonstrates some resilient design principles, but it also demonstrates that the emergency department in spaces like this are dynamic. This is an event-driven space, and it has to adapt to serve people with acute needs. And the recent need to meet social distancing guidelines and to separate COVID and non-COVID patients placed an even higher premium on the flexibility of this space. But this study also demonstrates that post-occupancy evaluation, or POE, is an essential method to help us understand how a space actually functions. And when we understand how a space actually functions, that could be a flywheel for adaptation and an input for design. It also suggests that non-experts, building owners, students, staff, can be empowered to conduct research on their own space and to identify areas for improvement. In this study, it was the medical interns and two doctors leading the medical interns that ultimately were leading the study inside the space and doing all of the surveying. And that was in partnership with deep discussions that we were having at where after collecting that data, we would all get back together and really try to understand the meaning of that information. But nonetheless, it points to that need to empower people to really understand their space. The next project I want to talk about is a project called Ideal Choice Homes. This project was done in partnership with Sam Circle Venture out of New Delhi and Bakari Group out of Ahmedabad. And this project addresses a significant housing shortage throughout India's cities. We started to engage this project in 2010 and worked on this project between 2010 and 2018. Really, in this project, the chief challenge was to look at existing construction technologies. We were focused on existing construction technologies for single and multifamily housing and trying to understand the evolution of those construction technologies. Some of the observations that were made by our partners had to do with the employment of wet masonry infill that was prolonging completion up to 24 months. In that prolonged completion was unable to keep up with the significant shortage of housing. We were also looking at material supply chains and construction technologies that likewise couldn't keep pace with demand. So in partner with our India-based asset management company and development company, we aim to design and engineer a whole building system solution. So this was very much about looking at building and construction systems and to see the problem. The team's background research and analysis explored all aspects of India's offsite fabrication industry, including supply chain development, production capability, as well as housing and construction typologies, familiar room use patterns, material availability, seismic and air pollution risks, as well as labor and more. And the primary component of the system is a precast C-shaped concrete panel that has multiple integrated functions. It works both as a wall and as a column, as permanent formwork. It's dimensioned to allow reinforcing configurations for different seismic zones. And it's also dimensioned to self-shade from sun and monsoon. And overall, the system, one of the driving factors here was time, an attempt to reduce construction time from an estimated 2 years to 3 months by orchestrating a legible construction sequence. Likewise, we were looking at creating a system that could respond to a wide range of seasonal variation, minimizing solar gains through overhangs and shading during the summer, encouraging air movement through cross ventilation and minimizing air infiltration in the winter. And then also designing a system that could expand from a single bay studio to a 3-bay, 4-bay multifamily housing structure, and really engineering this system with our structural team as one that could anticipate further growth, such as the addition of a room or the addition of an entire floor. So our development process emphasized a collaborative approach to prototyping, where we were prototyping here and with our partners in Ahmedabad. And we were addressing concerns about component weight, material availability, and fine-tuning several lightweight concrete mix designs concurrently with our partners. We also were exploring formwork design, casting and demolding with small scale and high capacity precasters. So we were looking at the scale of production as well as the capacity to create these different elements. And then we were also testing the entire system out, completing a first full bay prototype in 2013 that emphasized system legibility, material handling, assessment of individual components, time to build, and safety. And then a second bay prototype, which tested a higher capacity panel production, also looked at the horizontal expansion of the system, strategies for integrating electrical and plumbing surfaces, infill materials, and interior finishes. So this project in particular demonstrates some very specific principles about expansion and contraction of systems, but also it embodies an idea about designing for robustness, the ability to situate a construction system and construction logic in multiple contexts. One of the most important context that we were trying to address here had a lot to do with the structural design of the system and the ability to address seismic contexts. And then we were also working closely to design for growth and to look at the ways in which this kind of system might have the capacity to expand both horizontally and vertically. So in this instance, what you see is a system design, a speculative system design that we were testing through really a prototyping process, as well as a supply chain development and materials testing process. Okay, so the next project I'm going to offer up for discussion is a project that we engaged as a small part of a much larger team. So this project was in collaboration with GARE Hub, an NGO in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, UNICEF Mongolia, UNICEF Global Innovations, Arc'teryx in North Face, as well as the Center for Environmental Building Design at the University of Pennsylvania and the National University of Mongolia, as well as 5 families who allowed us to come into their homes and to work with them to understand some very specific aspects of air pollution in Ulaanbaatar. So, and this project, Designing the 21st Century GARE, it's a project that seeks to reduce indoor and outdoor air pollution in Ulaanbaatar's urban GARE district. It also seeks to immediately, I have to underline immediately here, we were on a time scale, improve respiratory health conditions for children, mothers, and communities in Mongolia. So the project team was challenged to focus on short-term solutions that could have a meaningful and measurable impact in the GARE district in the capital city. So by focusing on the GARE, which is the traditional structure that defines the GARE district, the project identifies housing and the current reliance on coal for heating as both a primary source of air pollution, but also a vehicle for change. So the burning of coal in hundreds of thousands of individual homes alongside central coal plants makes Ulaanbaatar one of the most polluted cities in the world. And during long winters, air pollution levels average more than 25 times WHO guidelines. And on cold days, PM 2.5 levels regularly exceed 100 times the recommended daily average concentration. So the GARE is a traditional structure and one that was originally used by families to inhabit the Mongolian plateau. And now it's relocated in this context and set up in these GARE districts. Exposure to air pollution at such levels causes severe health effects for residents, particularly for children, the elderly, and other vulnerable populations. So the economic impact on residents here is pronounced. Families in the GARE district spend 25 to 40% of their income on fuel. So and this is in a city where winter temperatures regularly reach minus 40 degrees Celsius. And this causes a condition of acute energy insecurity on top of growing economic inequity. So our multidisciplinary project team sought to answer 3 primary questions, and we had a very short time frame to do this, but we were trying to investigate which aspects of the GARE are most important to its performance, and how might we effectively and accurately measure and model the thermal performance of the GARE, but also which near-term design interventions are most effective at meeting the overall project goals that I just mentioned. So what we did is we implemented a 1-year program of design exploration, and we had to kick off that 1-year program in such a way that we were able to see ahead to the time in which we needed to actually implement these interventions in order to be able to measure the outcomes associated with those interventions, respective of the cycle of weather that's happening in this place and the cycle of construction that happens annually. So we started out by surveying material culture of GARE construction and learning from residents primarily about how they design, how they build, and how they maintain their home. Even though the GARE, when you looked at those previous slides, and you could see that there's different layers that go around the main frame, and that we're talking primarily about felted materials here. They sort of have this kind of image of looking the same. In talking with families about how they maintain their home, what you're going to find is that they're not all actually the same. Different families have different ways of putting different layers in different positions, of preferring different methods of treating the ground and treating the wall. And so we really wanted to learn from residents about how they design, build, and maintain their house. We also worked again with the five families I mentioned in the GARE district itself to monitor and measure individual GARE and develop a baseline understanding of the GARE's thermal performance. So we were looking at in situ measurements that would give us some sense about how the GARE was occupied and how the coal stove that you see there in the middle was fired, when it was fired, what was the temperature inside, what was the temperature outside. And then simultaneously, we established a test bed, which we dubbed the GARE Ranch, where our team monitored and measured the effectiveness of selected interventions to make recommendations and introduce new construction techniques at a much larger scale. So the GARE Ranch consisted of 6 experimental GARE, in which a series of prototypes for the door, the roof cover, the floors were evaluated over the course of a winter. And then the prototypes, sorry about that, the prototypes included an insulated door covering, a roof covering, as well as 3 variations for the floor, which either coupled or decoupled the floor from the ground. Each GARE was also equipped with continuous recording of temperature, humidity, CO2 levels to evaluate thermal behavior and analyze the effects of these various improvements. And heating was provided by electricity for a designated series of weeks. But we also, of course, in the GARE Ranch tested coal stoves. We were interested in sources of heating. We also were able to test a number of variations by removing insulation, adding insulation, and using other methods of ventilating the GARE. The GARE Ranch was monitored over a 9-week period. We had a very, very short window to get this implemented and monitor it. But between December and late March, we were able to gather some actionable data and really identify primary pathways for heat loss, while also understanding what it meant to improve the GARE and to meet these near-term goals. The result of the study showed that it was possible to improve the thermal performance of a GARE through simple, cost-effective measures. And since the conclusion of this study in 2019, over 100 GAREs in a regional town in Mongolia, and this would have happened this past year in 2020, had been deployed with a modified version of one of the GAREs in the test bed. What's I think really important maybe for our discussion here is we're looking at the Mongolian GARE, which is a 2,500-year-old building technology that is highly adaptive to change in its context. And much of the knowledge of both GARE construction and operation is tacit. Adjustment happens seasonally as a new layer, a skirt, or a vestibule is added or subtracted. And this highly resilient construction technology is now adjusting to the GARE district, which is a new system of planning that directly reflects the regional impacts of individual buildings and the needs for systems to consider individual human health impacts. All right, so the last project for our consideration and discussion is a project that's called Tally. So the project you're looking at is not Tally. The story of Tally begins with another Kirin Timberlake project, which is known as the Loblolly House, a house that's located on an ecologically sensitive site along Maryland's Chesapeake Bay. And the house was completed in 2007. It continues to be a wonderful test bed for experimentation. We have conducted numerous tests on this house and various components and aspects of this house, but there actually is one experiment that is planned for some time in the future. We don't know when. The house, which was fabricated off-site and then assembled on-site, can also be fully disassembled. So its components are designed and engineered to retain value. The house is designed for disassembly, and it does anticipate the site's restoration at some unknown future date. The House makes a bid to directly and proactively engage change over time. And in 2008, to play out this scenario, we wrote a specification for disassembly. So to understand the value of recovered materials, we calculated the avoided burden of additional CO2 emissions. And that was a back of the envelope calculation that was the initial spark for what is now known throughout the industry as TALI, the first life cycle assessment application that lets us calculate the environmental impacts of our building material selections directly in an Autodesk Revit model. And we know this about material and material impacts, or we have a growing understanding, especially in 2020. There's been so much discussion around material impacts. Buildings and infrastructure account for nearly 40% of all global CO2 emissions, and over a quarter of those emissions are from carbon embodied in building materials and construction. And although this seems like a small percentage, as emissions associated with building operations go to zero, the source of emissions associated with materials matters more and more. So what we're talking about is embodied carbon, and it is the CO2 emissions associated with materials and construction processes throughout the whole life cycle of a building, which includes materials extraction, processing, manufacturing, transport to site, construction, use, replacement, deconstruction, along with benefits from reuse, recovery, and recycling. And that's in contrast to operational carbon, which is the CO2 emissions associated with the energy used to run the building. So together, embodied carbon and operational carbon form a complete picture of the carbon emissions associated with buildings. Building owners, policymakers, material manufacturers, contractors, community stakeholders, engineers, and architects are mobilizing, actively mobilizing to tackle embodied carbon. And you can see here in this graph, at year one, embodied carbon could account for up to 90% of the building's total annual emissions. And then according to Architecture 2030, as buildings become more efficient, and if we were to actually look at the decarbonization of the grid, the angle of this graph might be a little different, but as buildings become more efficient, embodied carbon will be responsible for almost half of the total new construction emissions between now and 2050. So TALI, where does that come in? You can use TALI to model and measure environmental impacts, specifically embodied carbon. And furthermore, you can integrate carbon modeling into all phases of the design process, and these models can and should inform design decisions. So for instance, some examples from our own body of work. At the Tidelands, a project I mentioned at the outset, carbon modeling informed decisions on interior finishes, envelope, and structure. And in collaboration with our structural engineering team, we made significant embodied carbon reductions on the building structural system using low cement content concrete. At North Campus Housing, carbon modeling was used to study assemblies and whole building design options throughout all design phases. And here we were able to learn about the role of carbon neutral materials such as wood and the need to scrutinize the embodied carbon associated with other material categories like concrete and metals. And at Ortlieb's Bottling House, which I didn't talk a lot about, but that's the space I'm sitting in today, the deep retrofit of this 1940s beer bottling facility, which in 2015 became our home, proved that building reuse is one of the most effective strategies to tackle total carbon. And our calculations suggested that it would take 183 years of building operations to equate to the embodied carbon that we saved by retrofitting this historic fabric of the city. And finally, for KT Open Home, which is a new offsite housing system that we're developing right now in partnership with Benson Wood, who was the original fabricator of the Billie house. We've integrated a path to net zero embodied carbon, and we began to do this with a lot of our projects. That includes options for systems, design, detailing, and material procurement, a discussion that we're actively having during the design process. But what does all this mean? I think for us, when you look at TALI and you look at these practices, really we're much more interested in the practices or practice transformation. And we know that a building causes impacts far beyond its building site, and that we have an ethical obligation to tackle climate change on every project. The purposeful design of low or zero embodied carbon solutions demonstrates that building level decisions are directly connected to global climate change mitigation strategies. And furthermore, these new modeling practices require us to intentionally make changes to our own design practices. And yet, even though we can say, yes, there's this new emerging practice, when we engage in new emerging practices, it opens up a space for a lot more conversation. So in talking with users of Tally over many years now, and especially within the last year and a half, we've been collecting the next 10 things to tackle. And there are so many of them. What's the state of the question? What's the state of the data? What's a good number? Where should we be? These questions go on and on. The one question that has come up repeatedly is, yeah, we're talking about global impacts, but many of us are now curious in trying to understand when we're using data like this data is not specific to our communities and not specific to places and spaces. So how do we then begin to, if we're going to look at these issues of material impact, how do we do this in such a way that it does address robustly issues of environmental justice? And then there's a whole series of questions about all of the people that are part of a building and construction and architectural design process. And so we're talking about the relationship between embodied carbon and building manufacturer or product manufacturers, clients, policymakers. This is a rich area for further research. Okay, I'm finishing early. Never done that. I'm going to sort of slow down a little bit and now share with you, I think some of the questions that I think maybe comes out of the presentation. So what I've tried to show through these 4 projects and just really demonstrate in a much deeper way are aspects of our practice where we've challenged the system boundary of architecture, where we've created partnerships, where we've operated across different timescales, different paradigms. We've hybridized methods in order to ask other questions about what the outcomes might be or are associated with our built environment. So I think one of the first questions that I always carry with me is where is the system boundary of architecture? Do we carry around in our heads this idea that architecture begins and ends with a wall, or is that system boundary greater? If it is, how do we engage it? And how do we, through our own practices, begin to engage it robustly? But I also think that in our work, you see another thread of conversation, which is around this topic of who. Who are the designers, or who are we in conversation with? And I encapsulate that in this question of who, and with this question of what does it mean for us to pursue transdisciplinarity now? And I use transdisciplinarity in a very specific way. Yes, there's lots of disciplinarities, but I've begun to realize in reflecting on the last decade of work and speculation on transdisciplinary practices in 2008, that was part of my transition from full-time academia to the practice of care and Timberlake. We hypothesized that we needed to work with other people's knowledge, and we needed to engage people in conversation, and we needed to really look at the gaps and seams between disciplinary bound knowledge. And over time, we began to work on those gaps and seams and began to develop a better understanding that design is one method of inquiry among many methods. And how do we build up those conversations? I think the other question that is sort of maybe arises from this question is in particular, and maybe specific to you is, right now, what's the narrative of disciplinary boundaries in architectural pedagogy? This is a question I get asked quite a bit. I wrestle with myself as I teach my students. But what is that narrative, and how do we meaningfully begin to understand what that narrative is and what it might mean, and how it does shape the perception of our agency? And finally, the last question I like to ask is, what are the current barriers in your work? When you look at your work and when you look at what you want to do and where you want to go and what you want to work on, what do you think the barriers are? What do you think you're going to have to address or somehow work your way through? Okay, Blaine. I'm done.
You've given us so much to think about. You've
Did I
given us
go
all
too
these great
fast?
questions. No, it was great. Thank you.
Please,
I wish
please
we
take
had,
those as case studies, right? I mean, I can talk about any
yeah,
aspect of them.
absolutely. I know that you can. Thank you so much, Billy. And each project is worth, deep interrogation. Each question is worth deep discussion. So we only have the time that we have now, but it's a very special time. And it's time for students to share with you some of their questions.
Awesome.
And I
Okay.
might invite Mary Grayson to ask kind of general question
Okay.
about research protocol.
Hi,
Sure.
thank you so much for coming today. I'm Mary Grayson, and really enjoyed hearing about your research process, doing research UNCC, and just doing that. It's really important in architecture. You kind of hit on it in the beginning, but I wanted to know, what is the research process or protocol for each project that you do within Kieran Timberlake?
Yeah, Mary Grayson, I didn't show those slides. You're absolutely right. I didn't take you through our research process. I hinted at it. I said, yeah, there's a day-by-day process here. I think what you should know is that research is a process. I could talk to you endlessly about the research protocol, but let's just say at an incredibly high level, for each architectural project here, no matter the size, we set research goals at the very outset. And then we also, when we're working on projects, and here I'm talking about architectural projects, when we're working on architectural projects, the other thing that we do is we start each project with what I'll refer to as a research and environmental design report. That sounds like a lot, but we call it a red report. And what that actually does is, as designers, it sort of requires us to slow down just for a moment and ask a big question, which is, what is the context? Now, context, we might assume, means something very specific. Maybe it includes built fabric, but that's not quite what we mean. In this research environmental design report process, what we're actually trying to do is, from the outset of the project, describe the context in terms of, say, program and program innovation, climate, ecology, hydrology, environmental regulations, any specific aspects about community and community stakeholdering and engagement. And so what we're giving ourselves the space as designers to really articulate a set of questions, answer those questions, and then from that derive a better understanding of the project. That's one key part of our research process that's integrated into all of our projects here. And then ultimately, throughout the entire project delivery process, we have what I would call the central piece of infrastructure, research infrastructure, which I refer to as a research query. And it's a kind of catch-all for any question that we ask that we want to investigate systematically. So systematic investigation of questions requires us to basically say, here's the question we're asking. We haven't asked it before. We know that it's connected to a goal on this project. We can actually put research methods to it. We can answer that question. There will be findings, and we can take design action from it. Simultaneously, there's questions we ask that you can't take design action from. So in addition to the research infrastructure I'm describing to you, we also have to build, I think one of the biggest aspects of our practice is also building research culture, which means being able to withstand the fact that some of the questions we ask and some of the research that we do results in failures. It's not actionable. It doesn't take us anywhere. And that has to be part of the aspects of what we do as well. Did I answer your question? And then
Yes,
there's also research proposals. So we have a series of these things. Yeah.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Great,
I really
thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Dante has a question, Billy, that relates to one of your questions, actually,
Dante.
about transdisciplinarity.
Yeah.
Yes, hello, Billy. Thank you for the presentation. I am a research student. So to see that the research doesn't die in the lab and can actually be applied to remote applications, I do see value in that. When Blaine reached out to see if I could ask some questions, I did some research on you and watched a previous presentation that you gave at Georgia Tech in 2019. So one of the questions that came about from that presentation was, With your current experience at Karen Timberlake of integrating in-depth research with transdisciplinary organizations as part of the design process, how do you imagine architectural education adopting this workflow?
Oh, Dante, I want to grab a whiteboard and like have that discussion right now. It continues to be a really a central conversation and a central question that we asked. And I guess what I'm seeing as an educator is that I guess it's a couple of things. And it actually goes back to, there's this really wonderful article that was written in 2015 by Tanya Augsburg. It was a peer review article that looks at what, I think the title of the article is something like The Rise of the Transdisciplinary Individual. So it first looks at the fact that people, individuals might make choices to orient themselves to their professions in such a way that they start to become, I think what she refers to as, let's say, knowledge transgressors, going across the boundary and seeking other types of knowledge. And what I've seen more often than not is that studio is a space where that happens, and that can happen richly, and that it can happen profoundly. And it happens in a way, it can happen in a way that actually builds up conversation. The larger question, I don't know, Blaine, I'm wondering how you've tackled this. I've certainly tracked the work that you've done. I mean, how have you tackled building up discussions across disciplines within pedagogy?
Well, thank you. I'll try to be brief since everyone wants to hear from you.
I just did that. I just handed the question off to the director.
That was good. I'll just say that we're in a strategic planning process now. We're really beginning to ask some of these really fundamental questions that need to be answered ourselves, and rethinking. I think that's what something architects do, perhaps, is what if we just scrap the old model? What happens?
Yeah.
You know, just as a kind of thought experiment. I have had a little bit of opportunity, as some faculty here have had, to do interdisciplinary work. I don't know if it fully got to transdisciplinarity, but the interesting, really quick outcome I felt was to and this was at University of Minnesota. Yep. Where we worked with artists and biologists around questions of biomimicry and biodesign. And to the detractors among the faculty that said, well, that's not really an architecture studio, I found that for architecture students, that it was a really great understanding and clarification of some of these boundaries and capacities that not that architecture has boundaries, like rigid boundaries, but just capacities and ways of thinking. And I think, so that's a real quick answer to your handoff of the baton, but I think there's value in that as well, right? Yeah. And I'm sure that's a lived experience for you in your work.
It absolutely is. Like, Dante, I can recall for you the moments, what I refer to as these kind of wait what moments, where the boundary of my knowledge came up against the sort of ways of knowing, say, in another field like urban ecology or physics. And for me to see architectural knowledge, just catch a glimpse through that lens, just kind of like, it made that sphere even bigger. And I think right now what we're doing through projects like Tally, in some of these projects, what I was hoping to do was encourage you all to question those boundaries and to ask the question, who do we need to be in conversation with now? So yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. I'm working
continued.
To be continued. I'm working actively trying to work on this.
We need to work on this. You're leading the way, but I'd love to help.
I don't know.
Well, speaking of collaborations and partners and working with folks, Isabella has a question related to clients.
Oh, clients.
Isabella Silva.
Hi, Billie. Thanks for coming in today. I'm also part of research staff, so I do appreciate the kind of work that you do. I had a question. Over the past 12 years that you've been at Karen Timberlake, have you seen a change in clients since developing research-based projects or the amount of clients, or do the clients usually come to you, or do you usually find them?
Let's see. So in terms of what research clients, I have seen some changes, but I will say that an inquiry-based approach has been part of the philosophy of this firm for the past 36 years. So there has always been research at Karen Timberlake, and the biggest question was, how far should we go? And when I came here in 2008, we definitely had aspirations for, let's say, making our processes robust, clear, legible, accessible to everyone that was here, but also to ensure that we were having the kinds of conversations we wanted to have with our clients about the potential to understand and know their projects better. I benefited from the first 20 years of the firm, really, and really building up a conversation about research and practice. So some of the earliest projects that I did when I started here in 2008 carry forward a lot of conversations with clients about how to understand their projects better. So I showed a snapshot, a good example. One of the first ones was the Green Roof Vegetative Survey. That was done in partnership with 4 previous clients. And it was done as a way to understand how green roofs change over time, how it's not just a simple fill shade of green in a drawing, that a green roof is actually an ecological community. And we had clients who really wanted to understand how to better describe the function and purpose of green roofs for their campuses. So I have seen in the past 5 years, changes in the number of, let's say, clients who are looking to do very specific targeted studies that absolutely tap into our research expertise. But then also, I would say I've also seen another aspect of this. I won't call them clients so much as partnerships through grants have become much, let's just say, more possible in the last several years as practices and firms and industry in general, that we've all been invited to be part of those types of projects. So clients are an important aspect of the work that we do, both from the very beginning of a project to the end of the project, and to the sort of continuation of the project through a post-occupancy evaluation, if we're fortunate enough to be able to do that work with them.
That was great. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Nathan has a question related to your questions and how you formulate them.
Hi, I'm Nathan Steele. I'm in M2, first year M2 and a research assistant as well. And so my question has to do with the way you ask questions. So has the way you ask questions changed over the years? Or is it more project to project, day to day based, like the way you come up with these research questions?
Yeah, where do research questions come from? Nathan, where do your research questions come from?
Well, I'm working with like acoustics right now, so they're kind of just coming from that. But yeah. I guess day to day, what interests me, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you asked this question about questions. So you could see when I was giving the presentation, I relayed to you directly some very specific study questions, very specifically phrased study questions that were absolutely part of those research projects. But I think what I've learned is simple questions like, hey, what's going on up there, lead to more precise questions once you start leveraging, or let's just say, what's going on up there, which was a question that sparked our green roof vegetative field study. So a question like that sparked a study for 3 years. What's going on up there on that roof? A question like that is leveraged from your curiosity. So when you build a culture of inquiry, we have questions, these sort of informal questions that sort of arise from the sort of day-to-day practice of architecture that then get formalized through a lot of different processes. And we can talk about those processes. So we can make those questions more precise. through doing background research, doing literature review, really trying to articulate and understand who else is asking that question, or what aspect of that question they're asking, and in what context. But we absolutely trade in questions around here. So even our research, our database of all of our research queries, I mentioned the word research query earlier, so I'll use it again. Our database of all our research queries every research query begins with, what's the question you're asking? And then weekly, I just received it today, we send out weekly or bi-weekly, this sort of what's happening in research at KT. It starts off with what's the question that's being asked, and actually what's the goal? How is this going to impact an outcome? Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but questions are awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What is the book, In Search of a Better Question, or I forget the title of that book.
I don't know that one, Billie.
Or something, but I'll look for it. Excellent. So Ketke has a question that's very specific to the Ideal Choice Homes project.
Sure.
Or yeah, a general question about that.
Yeah. Ketke.
Hello, thank you for coming, and the projects are really wonderful, but I am kind of biased on the Ideal Choice, maybe because it's from India and I'm from India, maybe that's so. Since I know how people are here and how maybe they are biased for the traditional construction techniques, so when you adopted new techniques, I wouldn't say new techniques, but that are uncommon to that area, or maybe in general in India, what challenges did you face for in culturally or even climatically, I would say, if any?
Yeah, I'm really glad you're asking me this question. It was a central source of, or let's say a central point of discussion with our partners. We were working there with an architecture firm, a development company, and really what we were doing is we were picking up on a thread of history about offsite fabrication that started back in the 50s in India. There was a long-standing interest in those types of fabrication technologies. And in 2010, I think I mentioned that the project started right around 2010. There was yet again another sort of push to actually adopt those technologies through one of the 5-year plans. And that's really that was the catalyst for our partners reaching out to us, because of a lot of the work we had done up to that point on offsite fabrication. And there was a larger question about whether or not those technologies really were ones that would be helpful in this context. And I would say that is absolutely the underlying discourse in that project, Ketke. It absolutely about technology and technology adoption. What we did first is we did a very large background research project to understand and try to answer the question that you're asking. And I didn't show that part of the project, but what we noticed is that there were a lot of new technologies, construction technologies that were being adopted or being promoted. And there was a larger question from our partners about the efficacy of those technologies as well. That doesn't quite answer your question, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, right to question that aspect of the project. Completely agree with you.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Blaine, are we out of time?
We have time for one more question if you do.
I do, absolutely.
You're doing such a great job with all of these. Thank you for your time and investment and the answers for sure. Brian has a question that pertains a lot to some of your last points, especially around the question of tally and adoption of tally.
Yeah, let's talk about tally.
Hey, Billie, thanks so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the lecture. I'm a third-year graduate student as well, so I'm in my final semester, but I'm sort of interested in like the educational standpoint of your research. So in your opinion, like how can architectural education begin to address like materiality and energy consumption more to bring more attention to environmental concerns?
So, wow. I mean, in one sense, by sort of architectural education, I think by and large is addressing this in very, very specific ways through, I mean, you have to be incredibly direct. Like you just have to go address it. One hand, a studio brief is going to just say explicitly, we're going to address this. So Brian, I'm wondering if like there's a specific circumstance or instance that you're thinking of, or maybe are you talking about the subject and the knowledge associated with the subject? Or are you talking about overall outcomes?
I would say overall outcomes, just
yeah,
kind of how we can increase that awareness.
How can we increase that awareness? I understand. It's interesting with Tally started really as a project that I would say it was more of a project around advocacy. The practices that we introduced into a BIM workflow were normally practices of life cycle assessment practitioners who would often do that work after a building was constructed. So the building had to be completely built in order for the true bill of materials to be calculated, to know within a realm of uncertainty what the embodied environmental impacts were of that thing. And we were essentially saying, no, we've got to flip this around. There should be a level or a way of deciding, of understanding, of bringing this level of decision making to the table along everything else that we discuss. So what I've seen in, let's say, in schools of architecture, is absolutely taking on this practice, taking on the paradigm of let's say, thinking about change and change over time, thinking about ecological impact and bringing that right into school or seminar classes, bring it right into studio classes. Why is that important with outcomes? Is because I would say prior to that, a lot of our discussion on climate change had to do with how small we were and the scale at which we worked. One building at a time. We were responsible as architects for a very small percentage of what was built. Therefore, we were just sort of in this space of we didn't know which way to go. That project in and of itself and those practices that can be introduced through pedagogy begin to suggest that no, that's not the case at all. That there's more that we can do and there's other conversations to be had. And there's other ways of thinking about the decisions that we make on a day-by-day basis. And that's incredibly important for us to understand the ecological impacts. And then more increasingly, as I mentioned, associated with that information, we now have a whole range of new challenges ahead of us that I think are going to shape pedagogy even more specifically across topics like climate justice, environmental justice, and modern slavery. So we're going to have to take on those things as well. Long way of answering your question.
Right, thank you, Billie. Well, you've done a lot of, you've helped us a lot. I mean, these are questions and issues that many, if not all, architecture schools are struggling to grapple with, just in terms of severity, in terms of their magnitude.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the way that you exemplify leadership and synthesizing the key components needed to address these problems, like the kind of artificial dichotomy of, but very strong dichotomy between design approaches on one hand and scientific methodology, for example, which you synthesize so fluidly, I think, in your work, or between the kind of rigors of theoretical ideas or concept generation and then practical application. I really appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your thoughts, and also the example that you create, that you represent for us in architecture.
Thanks, Blaine.
So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for all your questions. It was a pleasure. And congratulations to those of you who are graduating. Amazing accomplishment.